Today we welcome Professor Don Miles of Biological Sciences with Will Cool Lizards Succumb to a Hot Climate?
Great. I'm not used to having a microphone. I'm usually screaming at the top of my lungs. It is also a little like being a Costco salesperson making smoothies. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a series that has had a number of esteemed colleagues giving summaries of the research. I was hoping for TV. Okay, what's going on? So what I want to do is to give you an overview of the work that I have been doing over the past 20 years or so. And it involves how lizards are contending with a rapidly changing climate. I want to start, though, with a story. I want to start with an adventure I had like around 2007, 2008. And you can't see it very well because of the lights, but a colleague and I, we had a research program involving the maintenance of throat color polymorphisms in lizards. And there's a photo here of Euta stansburiana, the side-blotched lizard. And this is a lizard species that has three different morphs. There's an orange, a blue, and a yellow morph, and each of those morphs corresponds with a different mating strategy, such that the orange morphs are superdominant males, the blue morphs are monogamous males, and then the yellow morphs are sneaker males. They don't have a mating strategy of defending a territory. What they do is they sneak and copulate with females and parasitize copulations from the dominant male. So I was working with Beth Bastians, and her goal was to look at whether there was other species that showed a similar kind of dynamic in their mating systems. So Beth was working with a colleague of mine, Barry Sinervo, and this was her first year of field work, and Barry asked if I would go down with her to find field sites and help her catch lizards. So we were going from Euta to this other group of lizards called Scoloporus. So the research involved traveling from Ohio or Santa Cruz for Beth's standpoint, and going down to this little town outside of Mexico City, Santiago Tolman. And this is a site where we knew that lizards, the species that we were interested in, occurred. And this is a species. This is Scoloporus grammicus. It's an interesting species in the sense that it's really a species complex. There's a diversity of races that are basically chromosomal races, so there's a lot of chromosomal rearrangements. But also, we thought that this would be a species that exhibited these throat color polymorphisms. So we went to the field, and it turns out that they do. I mean, after we captured some lizards. So males have an orange and a blue and a yellow, just like Euta, and females have an orange, a white, and a yellow. Anyway, that's some data that Beth caught or captured from the lizards later. So we went to this field site. We were at this place, Cerro Tolman, and we were searching a nopal field. We were told by our colleagues in Mexico that, Grammicus loves being on the nopal. Look in the nopal. So we went to this place. We went to a nopal field at 2,300 meters, and we searched and searched, and we saw lots of lizards, except they were the wrong species. It was Scoloporus torquatus, which is a lower elevation species. So we were thinking, well, where's the lizard? So we worked our way up the hill. We finally found the lizard at 2,800 meters, a shift of 500 meters from its original location, only about 15 or 20 years earlier. All right, so the lizard had shifted in its elevation, or the low elevation population probably went extinct or went into a state we locally extirpated. And so we were curious about that. So we spent hours looking for these lizards, hours, and we didn't find the species. And we pondered, why would it be the case that a population of Grammicus vanished at low elevation? So this is bizarre, because we always thought that lizards were fairly hardy. Okay, Wait. There we go. So my colleague, Fausto Mendez at UNAM, and Barry, we were discussing what might be going on. And we thought, is this a signature of climate change? Is this the first evidence that lizards are susceptible to warming temperatures? Well, I want to step back a little bit and just talk about what we are facing. So we are living in a warmer world. Temperatures have been rising. This is a figure showing changes in temperatures between 2015 and 2019. Where it's red, it's hotter. Where it's blue, it's a little cooler. But one thing you see is there's not a lot of blue. There's some blue in the middle here, but there's a lot of red. And a lot of red in areas like the Amazon and the Sahara, in southern Africa, throughout Europe, and up in the Arctic. Furthermore, we are witnessing a massive amount of carbon emissions, where we are currently dumping 30 billion metric tons of carbon per year. The area or the part of time where we have the maximum temperatures, it's the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. The estimated amount of carbon emissions was 2 billion metric tons of carbon per year. So we are exhibiting a massive dumping of carbon in the atmosphere, which has deleterious consequences in terms of temperature. So if you look at the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, this is a graph from the Mauna Loa Atmospheric Observatory. And we have carbon emissions here in 1960, all the way up to 2019. We've surpassed 400 parts per million. And you can see here, this is a smaller subset of the years, that we peaked 400 million in 2015, and we haven't gone below 400 parts per million since then. Well, why does that matter? Well, at the current moment, we are at Miocene levels of CO2, which means that we can expect to have a Miocene-type climate. And if conditions in terms of carbon emissions continue, we can expect to see an Eocene-like climate where we witness the warmest temperatures since the extinction of the dinosaurs. And this is shown by looking at the temperature anomalies from the 1800s through the late 2010s. And you can see that the temperature anomalies are growing in magnitude. Well, this portends a problem for lizards because it means that their environments are getting warmer. Now, if you look at the biological diversity in general, we have habitat loss, the fragmentation of remaining habitats, and then climate change. And the climate change has many faces. We have heat waves of increasing frequency and longer duration. There was one in France and Europe this past summer in 2019, where the temperatures exceeded 100 degrees in France for periods of over 2 weeks. Altered precipitation regimes. This can lead to shifts in the phenology or the timing of critical life history events. And these phenological shifts are critical for the persistence of ectotherms. Ectotherms have to be breeding at the proper time for the successful incubation of eggs, for the successful hatching of young when food is available. And if those shift, then we see the collapse of a population. All right, so what are some signatures? Well, you can't see this very well, but we have rising temperatures and alteration of rainfall patterns. And if the lights were off, you would see all these green things on the base of this shrub. These are some images from southern Australia. This is a shrub. It's lost its leaves, but these aren't leaves. These are dead budgies. So the temperatures exceeded the thermal limits of an endotherm. So these birds died of hyperthermia. We've also seen instances where a continent is on fire. This is a snapshot of the fires months in Australia. So all of this red, it looks like lava, but it's the bushfires as they took out the habitat in Australia. And then here's another episode. There were temperatures in Australia that reached 50 degrees centigrade. This is a sulfur-crusted cockatoo that died from heat stress. In addition, we're having superstorms. So the climate, it's being altered in ways that we haven't seen in recent memory, at least in my recent memory. And what does that have to do with lizards? Well, another problem, drought. We have superstorms and we have super droughts. So the lack of water. Well, in 1994, I published a paper in which I looked at one measure of physiological performance, locomotor performance, and how that might be used to look at the potential response of a terrestrial organism to global environmental change. We didn't use climate change at that time, it was global environmental change. And this is part of a symposium where a group of biologists got together and asked what are the responses of these altered thermal environments. And in this paper I had given the expected and rapid change in environments, small ectothermic terrestrial species may not have the ability to modify their geographic distribution. That is, they're going to be stuck. But the results that I presented suggest that there's only certain populations that are at risk, and for the populations, the evolutionary response is too long relative to the rate at which the environment is changing. That is, there's an evolutionary lag. And so the populations that are at risk are likely to not have the capacity to adapt to these changing conditions. So you might ask, well, why study lizards and not something else, like insects? Well, I like lizards. I like birds. I'm not a fan of insects. But lizards are a good model organism because, first, they're ectothermic. They're cold-blooded. One thing I want to say, if you have any questions, feel free to shout them at me. I'm going to ask some of you a question. Do you know of any other ectothermic species or cold-blooded species or groups? Amphibians, fish, insects, although there's some homeothermic insects. So there's a large group of species that are ectothermic. What this means is the animals obtain their heat from the environment. So they don't have the capacity to generate sufficient heat through metabolism to maintain a high body temperature. The other cool thing about lizards is that they vary in their mode of reproduction. So some species are oviparous, that is, they lay eggs, and other species are viviparous, so they are live-bearing. And the live-bearing species are likely to be more susceptible because they're holding the young in their oviducts, and the temperature that the female experiences could be lethal to the developing embryos. So the viviparous species have to be careful. Yeah?
Do any lizards show temperature-dependent sex determination like turtles do?
There are some, yes. And that's a problem too, but the majority of lizards are characterized by genetically determined sex determination. The other thing is lizards are an important intermediate predator. That is, they're like an energy capacitor. So they eat a lot of insects, and then there are a lot of predator species that consume the lizards as their main prey base. And the other thing is we can quantify the potential body temperatures of the lizard based on the microhabitat occupied by the lizard. The more questions that you ask, Rox told me that she was going to give me a Bobcat card with $2 per question. It will get more questions. All right, so you're an ectotherm. And when you're an ectotherm, you have to balance all sources of acquisition of heat and dump heat when you're too hot. So as endotherms, as homeotherms, you really don't have to worry about heat because you're generating heat internally. But you do have to worry about overheating. How many of you ever had an episode of overheating? Anybody have heat stress or heat stroke? All right, what did you do besides go to the hospital? Well, if you're hot, what do? You water. You take your coat off, or you go into an air-conditioned room and drink water, right? What if you're too cold? You put on layers, right? Well, lizards don't have that. They have scales, so they can't put on layers. So here we have a generalized We'll call it a Dipsosaurus dorsalis or desert iguana. And these are all the sources of heat that the lizard can get. So there's direct radiation from the sun, so warm. I miss the sun. We have scattered solar radiation, so sunlight reflecting off the clouds or the dust particles in the atmosphere will come down and heat the lizard. You can have thermal radiation coming off of the ground and warming the lizard. So that would be a case of thigmothermy, so the lizard warms up by pressing its body against the substrate. And then the lizard can lose heat because of the effects of wind blowing over the lizard and losing heat through convection. Or the lizard can go into a burrow and dump heat to the soil, because as one descends into the deeper parts of the soil, soil temperatures decline and they reach a constant temperature. And so lizards can avoid the effects of warm environments by retreating to a burrow. What if it's warm for a long period of time and you're a lizard and you're in a burrow? What does that mean? What's that? You're not getting out to eat, or mate, or defend your territory. Let's say it's a territorial species and the lizard goes down to avoid the heat. Other males could come in and take over that territory. So it's a really delicate balance that lizards have to have in order to maintain their body temperature within a constant, or let's say a relatively limited range of variation. And there's consequences to the variation in the temperature the lizard exhibits. All right, let's jump back to the lizards. In 2010, a group of colleagues and we published a paper in Science entitled The Erosion of Lizard Diversity by Climate Change and Ultrathermal Emissions. This is based on our finding that Scalopus grammicus had disappeared from a low elevation habitat. So one of the things that happened is we were talking with Fausto, and Fausto said, we were in the Yucatan, and we were looking for a species of Scalopus, this one, Scalopus serifer, and he said, we can't find it in one spot. So we said, well, what do you think that might be? What is the mechanism that would lead this? This is a large species, too. It's about 7 or 8 inches from the tip of the snout to the pelvis. So it's a big, beefy lizard. So could the disappearance of this species answer the question about Scalopus grammicus? So we embarked on a project where we recruited various herpetologists in Mexico. And Fausto organized a resurvey of the various sites in Mexico where 48 species of Scalopus had been originally sampled. So we had this resampling in 2006 through 2008, and we sampled sites that had been surveyed between 75 and 95. We found 12% of the sites had an extinction event. All right, so this was perplexing. Within a span of 15 to 20 years, we had extinction of these lizards. What could be going on? So what we did is we asked, well, is there a temperature change in Mexico? So there, you see these black dots on the map of Mexico. Those are weather stations. And so we obtained the temperature data from 1975 to 2008. And what you see plotted here is the change in the temperature across the Mexican landscape. And what do you notice about pattern? Anything? So where it's red, it's bad. That means temperatures have gone up. It's good. Temperatures have not risen that much. Well, I gave it away. It's right up there. The rise in temperatures is most severe in January to May. This is also the part of the year where viviparous species in their oviduct, which is deleterious for their successful reproduction. So we found that viviparous species were most susceptible to these increases in temperature during this period. And in addition, neonatal survival was affected. There's also an increase in May, which is another part of the reproductive season of Scalopris.
So Don, you're only picking out one variable. What makes you think that's the dominant variable?
We're going to get to that. That's a good question. That's a good question. This is rather simplistic, I admit. So we asked, is there a difference between the extinct sites and the extant sites? So extant would be the sites where the lizards were still present. So what we did is we built these models. These are copper models of lizards. And we measured something called the operative environmental temperature. And this is the temperature that a non-thermoregulating object would attain when it becomes at equilibrium with the gains and losses of thermal radiation. So we made these models and we deployed them in the environment where the lizards were still present and those where they were absent. And here's what we found. These are the extant sites, these are the extinct sites, and these are the different months of the year where we got samples. This y-axis is the number of hours that are above the body temperature of the lizard. Now remember, when the temperature outside is above the body temperature of the lizard, they're going to be uncomfortable, a little bit stuffy. What you see at the extant sites, that the hours above TB never really approached more than 6 hours during the day. And that's pretty typical. During the hot part of the day, the lizards go in, they retreat, they go to the burrow, maybe they go to a McDonald's or something, they get a burger and a fry. But the thing is that they avoid the heat, and they're not really that thermally stressed. However, if you look at the extinct sites, in January there's a difference, but it's still below 6 hours. You get into February and then March, and you see that the extinct sites, you had 14 hours of the day above the body temperature of the lizard. Basically, we estimated that a Scalopris serifer could go out from its retreat, hang out for half an hour, and go back in before it overheated and died. All right, so these were thermally lethal sites for the serifer. These were the sites where the serifer went extinct. Now we have another graph here. This is the difference between the maximum air temperature less the body temperature. And so we have situations where TB is a little bit above Tmax, and then where the maximum temperature is above TB. And then we have the number of hours above its temperature. Take the slope of this, and that gives you the answer to the number of hours that lizards are restricted from being active above the surface. What we found was that there was a critical threshold for the hours of restriction that predicted the extinction of lizards. What we also noticed that if you look at this trace, this is the trace of temperatures for a given hour of the day for several days, for 4 days. And this is the range of body temperatures displayed by a lizard. This is the maximum temperature above which the lizard will overheat and die. And you can see that there are these pulses of time where the lizards are unable to be active. And then there are other episodes where they have no constraints. So we were seeing in areas where this Tmax is above TB that the lizards were at risk of it going extinct. Now we can plot it in a different way. This is before warming, and we have the minimum temperature in the environment. So that would be the cool temperature. And then we have the maximum operative temperature. And then there's this little area where the lizards are capable of being active without overheating. You get to a period of time after global warming, and here it's too hot. And you see that the hours of activity available shrinks as a consequence of climate change. So you had a bit of time here and here. So there was sufficient time for the lizards to be active, to feed, to mate, and to survive. All right, so what we did is we asked, knowing what the hours of restriction threshold was, and the temperature variation, what patterns would we predict in terms of the persistence of species? So there are two graphs here, or figures. This is a plot that shows the magnitude of natural selection operating on body temperature for the lizards to persist in a warmer environment. And this is the extinction probabilities, or you can think of it in a more positive way, the persistence probabilities. Where it's red, you have a low probability of persistence. Where it's blue, you have high probability of persistence. And we partitioned the data into 75 to 2009, so that is a prediction of the current data, 75 to 2050, and 75 to 2080. The thing to note is that by 2050, many of the viviparous species are at risk of going extinct. By 2080, there's a large extinction spasm where many of the populations of viviparous species in Mexico are anticipated to go extinct. For the oviparous, it's not that bad because the females lay their eggs in the substrate. Yeah, question?
I know that you said that the live bear lizards are more at risk and it's more severe since they'll like be adults and the babies. But is it just as bad in terms of killing off the young ones when it's egg bearing as compared to them?
What happens with the egg bearing? That's a really good question. What happens with the egg laying species that the young emerge in July and August when the temperatures are cooler and there's rainfall. So this period of time between January and May is dry and it's hot. So we have this pattern of extinction. Oviparous species are not as susceptible to loss of viable populations as a consequence of climate change. The other thing to note is that the amount of change in a character has to be extreme. So the selection differential of 0.5 means that there has to be a half. I'll have to explain this. So this is measured in phenotypic standard deviation units. And what it means is that you have to see a fairly large shift in the trait in order for the population to persist. And these are values that are rarely seen in nature. That's the main point. All right. Now then we ask, well, what about global patterns? If we have a projected temperature increase, what do we see globally? And this is what we see. So we merged hours of restriction with maximum temperature. We got collaborators to give us data on extinction events that they have seen. And we used to see how the extinction spasm would go globally. All right, we have the same sort of thing. We have the present, 2050, and 2080. And this panel is for species that have body temperatures less than 29 degrees C. This is for species 29 to 32. This is for 35 to 32, and 35 to 38. The point of the plot is extinction risk depends on the body temperature of the lizards. For cool-bodied lizards, they are more at risk. For warmer-bodied lizards, they are not as susceptible to the extirpation of local populations due to rising temperatures. So you can see there's not much red in these plots. You do get a little bit more, for example, in the Sahel of Africa, in Southern Africa, Australia, and South America. But everywhere else, it's not as severe. If you look at it globally, this is a summary. Based on our data, by 2009, we saw a 4% pattern of local extinction. By 2050, we expected an extinction pattern of 6%. And by 2080, we expected 20% of lizard species to go extinct. The problematical thing is that these extinction spasms occur in the areas of the world that have the richest reptile diversities. Australia has the highest diversity of reptiles in the whole world. Mexico is second, and South Africa is third. So the extinction patterns are concentrated in the areas where we have the highest biological diversity. All right. So we might ask, well, what makes an ectotherm vulnerable to climate warming? Well, if the physiology of the organism is sensitive to temperature, that is, the rate of temperature change results in a rapid increase in the physiological parameter, that will be a problem. If the environmental temperatures are already warm relative to its optimal temperature, and if the species is unable to use acclimation, that is, to adjust its body temperature in the short term to contend with higher temperatures, or to use behaviors to buffer climate warming, that is, to engage in behaviors, let's say, earlier in the day to avoid overheating, or to shift the microhabitats in which the lizard is engaged in their behavior. All right, so the key thermal traits are, for our studies, thermal preference. That is, lizards have a preferred temperature. That's a temperature they select that maximizes their physiological performance. We all have a preferred temperature. What's your preferred temperature? 70? 80? Mine's 62. I lived in England for many years, so I buy a lot of sweaters. And I don't like giving money to AAP. Then there's the optimal temperature of physiological performance. And this is the temperature at which the individual is capable of running faster or jumping higher or whatever the performance metric is. And then you have the critical thermal minimum and thermal maximum. What do you think the critical thermal minimum and maximum might mean? Any takers? Yeah. Yeah, so below the critical thermal minimum, it's too cold for them to move. You saw the headlines in Florida about the falling lizards, the iguanas. It gets too cold for them. They drop out of the trees because they lose their ability to grasp onto the branch. So people are walking around waiting for the lizard to fall on them. The critical thermal maximum is temperatures above which the lizard loses its ability to engage in coordinated movement. Nerve impulses break down, proteins denature, it's a physiological mess. So these are two critical limits that determine the range of temperatures that lizards are able to perform. Now we do a lot of measurements of thermal preference, that is finding out the comfort zone of the lizard. So we have these lanes, we have a heat bulb at one end and an ice pack at the other. We put the lizard in there. Here's an example of a lizard. It's got a little tape around its belly where there's a thermocouple affixed to it. And we record the temperature over a period of 60 minutes or 90 minutes. And we watch what the lizard does. And it's amazing. You put the lizards in there, and they're all aligned at about the same part of the gradient. They're all selecting like 36, 37. They're like in the butter zone. Sometimes they get cranky and they go over here in the cold part and sulk. And then they go back and get warm. So you have behavioral differences in what the lizards do, but generally they love being warm. Not too warm, not too cold. Now, with that information about the preferred temperature, you can ask, well, how does performance change with body temperature? So here's body temperature on this axis, and then some measure of performance. It could be sprint speed, digestive performance, so how rapidly a lizard consumes a prey and then defecates the prey item. And then you have the two temperatures that bracket the range of activity, so CT min, CT max. And so there's this optimal temperature of performance called T-opt. And then you have the range of temperatures that the lizards select as their preferred temperature. And then you have a performance breadth, so that's the range of temperatures that lizards can do, let's 80% of maximum, something like that. All right, so with this data, we can do much more in terms of predicting where lizards would be most likely to succumb to rising temperatures. So this is getting more information, right? Not just air temperature, but we're getting more mechanistic kinds of variables regarding the lizard's capacity to do things in different environments. Yeah?
At the very beginning, when you showed the 3 different colors.
Mm-hmm. The morphs.
Okay. What is the connection with, it was yellow for the males?
Yes, orange, blue, and yellow.
Okay, so is there a difference in the morph, I'm not sure that I'm connecting this, with what their survival rates are, based on like would the blue be more
Yes, but,
than the yellow?
Repeat the question.
oh yeah, sorry. The question is, do the morphs show differences in the survival of the morphs? So do yellow males have a different survival than blue males and orange? Yes, but in part it's due to social aspects, and it's also due to the kinds of thermal environments. So the orange males select the more favorable thermal environments, but that's also where predators are found. So the orange males, because they are super dominant, they are amped on testosterone, so they're always out displaying. Right? They're defending territories and trying to attract females. So they're busy being active, and predators see them, and then so they have a higher rate of mortality because it's an interaction between the thermal environment and their behavior. Yellow males, they behave like females. So they have very low rates of predation because they're skulky, and they don't want to draw attention to themselves. And then blue males, they behave in a cooperative manner, so they tend to protect one another. So they have intermediate values of survival. Again, that's not related to temperature per se. There is a temperature relationship between the morphs because they select different environments. So that's the interaction between the social and the thermal. Yeah, good question. Now, in terms of the operative temperature, if you put out these models, one gets a trace of temperature over time, and this is for for 2 years, a model placed in the same tree. In 1 year, we have this dark line. This is a normal year, normal pattern of rainfall, and then the lighter gray line is a drought year. And what happens in the Sonoran Desert, the mesquite trees drop their leaves because of drought stress, and it opens up the habitat so there's less shade. And so in a normal year, it's the case that lizards can be active almost the whole day. In a drought year, they have a severe constraint on their activity. So one consequence of climate change is increased frequency of drought, which further affects the need for lizards to avoid overheating. So they have less time available for critical activities. Now, how does this all play out? Well, we have the thermal environment here. The thermal environment transduces to the behavior of the lizard and its body temperature. The lizards are trying to get to some optimal temperature for performance. This enhances their performance, and then higher levels of performance means they have higher growth, survivorship, and reproduction. So this connection between the environment and ultimately the organism's fitness or its reproductive success. So the critical thing for us is to understand how behavior can be an organismal filter, because this can be an important way of lizards buffering the effects of climate change. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, have there been any studies or any data on how lizards that do manage to survive and reproduce in these, like, in areas that are heating up, like, does it affect the offspring, like intelligence or?
Yeah, so there is evidence that the cognition of lizards is affected by higher temperatures. So the question is, does temperature affect offspring traits like cognition, survival, et cetera, growth? Yeah, it does. It depends on the situation, so it's almost species specific. So in Europe, there's a lizard species, the common lizard, and it breeds in bogs. It's basically a wet-skinned lizard. And the thing that we're noticing is that the offspring hatch, and so the eggs are laid in the peat. If the offspring hatch during a heat wave, the young come out and they bake. So that is a survival problem. There is evidence to suggest that the temperature of incubation also affects cognition, so the ability to learn. And there is evidence that lizards learn. So when you're looking at your pet bearded dragon and thinking it's not that smart, it's looking at you. And then we have performance, so the physiology. So you have here, it's better put, ambient temperature affects body temperature, and that affects fitness. And that's the connection that we have been investigating. So I want to go through and look at some contemporary examples. So what I showed you, that little story about the Scoloporus grammicus species, that was all done in the early part of the 21st century. I like saying that. So the data are over 12 years old, and given the pace at which climates are changing, do we have any examples of contemporary responses to climate change? And I'm going to discuss a few, and because they're cool. So one example is the toad-headed agama. And this is a widespread species throughout Saudi Arabia and into Asia. You can't see it very well, but they have these slender legs. They have a curly tail. This is a Phrynocephalus from Saudi Arabia. This is the Turin phrynocephalus. I wish we had the lights off. When they open their mouth, they have this flare, and it's a signal, and it's a short burst signal. It's a dominance or a signal that startles prey. So we look at the physiological patterns of these species. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about species distributional models. I'm just going to talk about the car and not the engine or the machine. You don't know you don't need to know how it runs, just to know what it does. So what we do is we take data on the geographic space, and we get other layers like temperature, rainfall, etc. And we can have rainfall at different seasons, rainfall during the hottest part of the year, etc. So we can have all these layers. And then we can map this into an environmental space. And from that, we can combine them with some sort of response function. So how does all this data predict the location of the species? And then we can ask, given some future climate scenario, so we can take layers, but project it into the future, and ask, well, we know what the current habitat is. What happens with the distribution in the future, so we can future project. Now, one thing is, like that first example with the extinction of the Mexican Scalopus, that we used one variable. We used temperature. There are 19 variables that we typically use. These are called bioclimate variables, so there's temperature, precipitation, etc. So we have a wealth of data globally. So we can go anywhere in the world and ask what kind of temperature or precipitation pattern you would see, let's say in Athens, Ohio, or Athens, Georgia, or Athens, Greece. Doesn't matter. We can get that data. We could put it into this box, pull the crank, or press run, and we get the patterns in the present and then in the future. I've simplified it, and I apologize to Diego, but that's the way it is. So what we did a species distributional model for the Phrynocephalus. There's 17 species. This is for the whole distribution of the genus. So we have some down here in Arabia and into Iraq and Iran. I'd point out Ukraine, but you know. Anyway, where it's blue, the species are persisting. Where it's red and orange, that's where they're at risk of extinction. This is for the year 2070 with what's called a representative concentration pathway of 4.5. Yeah, question? So the question is, do species migrate between the areas? And the thing is that species can disperse, but the dispersal distance is small, maybe 100 meters a year, compared to the rate at which the climate's changing. But yeah, we do see that there is dispersal movements. And in fact, in Arizona, we've noticed a range shift for a couple of species that is on the order of a few kilometers. Anyway, so what we see here is that there are some areas in Asia and Arabia where the species are at risk of extinction. And this is an emission scenario that is sort of not the best case, but the next best case, that emissions will taper off at some point. And then this is the worst case where we're just going to burn coal. And so you see that the extinction areas increase for the Arabian, for the stands, and into China. What we see there are these pockets of persistence, but they're in the periphery of the range of the genus. Now, if you look at the national park system in China, the main national parks are nowhere near where the species are at risk. So there's a management mismatch where the habitat that should be available to protect these species is not available. And so we have colleagues in China that we are working to increase the prominence of this problem in terms of protecting biological diversity.
There's connectivity too. Can they get there?
Well, the statement is there's a problem about connectivity, and there's not a lot of connectivity, so there might have to be a human translocation, which is its own problem. Another example is from a tropical lizard. This is a Kentropics calcarata. It occurs in Brazil. And we had a team of biologists that sampled across the range of the species. We did a species distributional model, and this is what we got. So this is a present distribution. Where it's blue, it's good. This is 2050 with RCP scenario of 8.5. So an extinction risk of 53.7%. And at 27, we see most of the range is gone, and only a pocket of habitat is left to protect the species. One other example, a high elevation species, Barizia imbricata. This is a beautiful high elevation alligator lizard. They're tame because they're so cold they can't move very fast. So they're easy to catch. But they live among ferns and grasses. And we measure their body temperatures. They're a high elevation specialist. So this is 40 degrees centigrade, this is 10. They have most of their body temperatures in this low range, although their preferred temperature is around 30 to 31 degrees. So this is what they contend with, this is what they want. We did another distributional model, and going from the present to 2080 with an RCP of 2.6, which is the best model, to 4.5 to 8.5. You see that the montane species have an increasingly rapidly disappearing habitat. So you might ask, is there any reason to have any kind of optimism? I think, yeah. We're going to see some changes in the species that are present. But if we look at the species that can use behavior to evade the warming, that is just avoid it, that will be a group of species that can persist. And here's an example of that. This is a species in Africa, in Namibia. It's Pedioplanus husabensis. It's a microendemic. It's found in a very small area. It's found in Namibia. If you've never been to Namibia, I highly recommend it. It is the most gorgeous country in Africa, among the most gorgeous. I don't want to be dissuading people from going elsewhere. This is the area where it's found. So this is Swakopmund. It's in an area just a few kilometers away from Swakop. We have the distribution. The open circles are where it's found. The dark black circles are locations where it had been caught by my colleague Sebastian Kirchhoff. The thing is, it has a very high CT max and a very high body temperature for its preferred TB. So it can withstand high temperatures. And it also likes to go into cracks and rocks. And so if you look at its risk of extinction, I mean, there is a little extinction area, but in general, the persistence pattern is pretty constant. So this is a species, because of its pattern of thermoregulatory behavior, will likely persist well into the next century. And then the last one, Moroli suborbitalis, this little creature here. This is a species that loves to live in rodent burrows. In fact, here's a rodent in the Dune Street in South Africa, the Kalahari Transfrontier Park. The Morolis live in this area. They like the burrows. And the reason they like the burrows, well, I'll show you another picture. It's just, this is a dune street. You have these dune ridges here, and then this is a large open area. I like that it's open because there are lion here and leopards, and so you can see when you're going to be attacked by a predator. Now, here's the problem faces Morolis. The secretary bird. The secretary bird moves around looking for lizards. It's a lizard specialist. And if the lizard is caught too far from its burrow, it loses its ability to move fast because it overheats and its performance drops. So the lizard wants to be in a very narrow range of temperatures to optimize its sprint performance. So we did these measurements of the environmental temperature, and you see that the temperature goes up, and by 2 o'clock it's too hot for the lizards to be active, so they retreat to the burrow. And even in the shade, by 3 o'clock it's too hot for them to be active. And Not surprisingly, you see that this is a measure of the thermal quality of the environment. And so the bars represent when they're active. And so they're active during a part of the day where the thermal quality is good. And this is the line for the burrow. And the burrow temperature is always around 35. So they will retreat to the burrow to avoid predation. And then this is the summary of the projected extinction pattern, the current distribution. So they're found in the Kalahari and on the coast of South Africa and Namibia. This is what we predict in 2070. This is the gains or losses, and we find that there's not much of a extinction spasm, but more of a distributional shift. So there are certain parts of the range where you see there's red, that's bad, but then there's areas of green where they'll persist up through 2070. All right. Just to look at it a little closer, you see this red here, but then there's a lot of green. Yeah.
I'm just going to give you a 10-minute warning so that way you can make sure that people just ask random questions.
I'm going to finish up in a moment. Okay.
Okay, my question is, could lizards be on a risk of going extinct and then no longer be on that risk?
Yes, it's entirely possible for the lizards to become. Thank you. Is it possible for a lizard to be at risk of extinction and then not be on that list or that risk? Yes, there's that possibility. And the possibility can be accomplished through either adaptation, so that they evolve higher thermal preferences or higher thermal tolerances, or there's something called maternal effects, and so the behavior of the female when she's carrying the eggs, if she raises her body temperature, that can affect the temperature that the young have, so that they have their body temperature at a higher level. So there's two opportunities for that. So that, yes, that is possible. And also remember, these are projections. We're not saying this is set in stone. All right, so additional reasons for optimism. Well, lizards have persisted through various warm periods in the past. So it's not as if the lizards haven't withstood this kind of environment. The problem is it's happening more quickly than in the past. Some may be able to adapt. Some may acclimate. Warming may be beneficial to montane species. It'll be warmer, so they won't be having to spend more time thermoregulating. But lower elevation species may move up, and so you have competition between species that did not previously overlap or come into contact. And just to conclude, when using operative models, you can identify a thermally suitable habitat. So this is a way we can identify where lizards could be, and we could use that for translocation. The failure for lizards to adapt is going to be bad, but not including these physiological and behavioral traits will impede our ability to make predictions about how lizards will persist or if they will persist in the future. Behavior can buffer lizards, so behavior is a powerful thing. It can remove a lizard from a bad situation and engage the lizard in a period of let's say, inactivity, but as long as it's not too long, they can withstand these warmer environments. Adaptation is not likely to be a possible response, but it's also not ruled out. And the last thing, and this gets to your question, plasticity and maternal effects can be a potential response to cope with climate change. So that's the end of my story. Thank you.
So, additional questions? There's one at the back over there.
Diego?
Have you come across any evidence of the territoriality of the lizards as we respond to climate change? So if they need a place with a shadow, I imagine they may defend a greater territory. That indicates how that might affect the very constitution of
So the question is, do lizards defend a territory that includes shade or some, let's say, thermal retreat? And does that have an effect on the genetics of the population? Yeah, so lizards will defend shade, and that can alter the patterns of overlap among males and females, depending on the distribution of shade. So one of the things that we need to worry about is what is the thermal heterogeneity of the landscape? And so if it's patchy, such that the favorable habitats are separated quite a distance where the lizards cannot come together, you have what's would be called an Ali effect. That is, the lizards, or any species, they don't bump into each other enough to engage in, let's say, mating behavior or reproductive behaviors. Does that answer your question? Okay.
And there's a question there.
Yeah.
So you mentioned lizards moving upwards amongst each region.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen evidence of that? And if you have seen evidence of that, have you seen resources like prey or plant?
What was the last part?
Have you seen food resources like prey or plant?
Okay, so the question is, have we evidence that lizards are moving up in elevation? And is there also evidence that the prey base moves up in elevation in concert? And we have a very good example of lizards moving up in elevation in Mexico. So there's two species of lizards in the genus Scalopus, Scalopus aeneas and Scalopus bicanthalus. Bicanthalus is a high elevation specialist. Aeneas is a lower elevation lizard. It's oviparous. Bicanthalus is viviparous. Aeneas has been moving up, but its limits to the range in terms of the elevation was restricted by the temperatures that are suitable for the development of their eggs. And so a few years ago, we saw evidence of Scalopus aeneas crossing, it's a 2,000 meter barrier. We saw lizards, the oviparous species, in that area above 2,000 meters. And about 5 years ago, we had hatchlings appear above 2,000 meters. So the temperature has warmed enough so that the soil temperatures are warm enough for the eggs to develop. And the other thing about the diet, lizards pretty much will eat whatever they can get in their mouth. So some, that's not true. Some are ant specialists, so they'll only eat ants. But Scalopus, by and large, will eat ants, caterpillars, grasshoppers. But that's a good question, because it's not always the case that the prey base will move upward with the lizard. Hi. There's one over there.
Is there anything we can learn from the history, like when there was a similar warming or cooling, and what happened to these temperature-dependent?
Yeah, so the question is, can we learn from history when times were warmer and what was the other part?
There was a
Similar warming period, yeah. Yeah, so what one can do is to get a group of lizards that are closely related and then reconstruct their evolutionary history using molecular methods. And so you can get a tree. And then it's possible to date the tree to figure out when these branching events occurred. And then you can use paleoclimatic reconstructions. And so you can estimate what the body temperature of the ancestral species were, these hypothetical ancestral taxa, and then ask what's the climate of that particular time slice, and ask, does the temperature of the lizards, or whatever the species is, match the paleoclimate? So that's something we've done with tortoises, where we've got a tree of tortoises. Sounds weird, but it's true. We've reconstructed their body temperatures, and then we constructed paleoclimate landscapes. And so we found tortoises, the areas where they would persist, so these are desert tortoises in California. The desert tortoises will persist in grass. So it's kind of ironic that you take a Californian species and transplant, which I think is currently happening anyway. So yeah, you can do that, absolutely, yeah. And there was a question there? So the question is, what are some of the ecological roles of the species that I mentioned that were at risk of extirpation? These are largely insectivorous species that are intermediate in the trophic web. So they will feed on insects. Some will be herbivorous, but their main role is to be prey for birds and other mammals and snakes. And so you can think of them as being an intermediate trophic level species. And so the collapse of that species will represent a loss of a prey base for a higher trophic level. So snakes are important lizard predators, so that would be bad.
Last question.
Are there any special considerations for herbivorous lizards that might be different from the rest of them?
Yeah, so the question is, are there considerations for herbivorous lizards that would depart from, let's say, considering an insectivorous lizard? So there are. There are not many herbivorous lizards, but there are whole clades, so where you have one species, you have many. One important group of herbivorous lizards lives in South America, and they're in the genus Phymaturus, or in Argentina it's Phymaturus. And the Phyma, they live in high elevation habitats. They're strict herbivores. But they're kind of buffered because they have this high elevation environment, and they're also in an area. So South America is a bizarre continent because it's bulgy at the top and then very narrow at the tip. It's kind of like a lamb chop, or I don't know, tofu if you're vegan. Anyway, so at the very lower part of Argentina, you have the overwhelming effect of the maritime climate. So it doesn't get as warm occurs. Now for iguanas, they're in the tropics, and they may have a problem if more rapidly than other places. Marine iguanas, that's a concern. Marine iguanas, as you know, are the only lizard that lives in the marine environment, and they feed on algae, but only the males go out into the subtidal and feed on algae. The females and the hatchlings, they feed on the intertidal, so they'll eat algae that's exposed at low tide or insects. And so for the marine iguana, if there's an El Nino event and there's an algal die-off, you'll see a crash in the populations of marine iguanas. So there are, herbivorous lizards do have an issue, but they also tend to have interesting distributional patterns that can be handled using these climate models.
Let's thank Don for an interesting discussion.